All right, well, I'm going to get our evening started. So first of all, thank you so much for being here. Also, thank you for your flexibility. So I know that some of you were with us at the town hall meeting yesterday at Sanibel, so we appreciate your flexibility and for you changing your schedule to be with us tonight. We have this great audience here, and I know that there's a lot of folks joining us online, and so just thank you for being here this evening. And just to remind you that this was set up as a part of a two-part series. However, we did set this up so that you could have gone to the event last month. You could go to this one. You could go to both, but you'll enjoy the content for either. But what I am going to do is I'm going to spend a little time kind of anchoring us into the thematic ideas that we used to sort of tie everything together. So you're going to notice, if you did come last month, you'll notice some of the same imagery. But really what we're talking about is we're talking about how SCCF takes care of our estuarine and our coastal environments, but we're also looking at that specifically through a human health lens. And one of the things that we think about is if we think about our own health, we think about the fact that you need to coordinate between a whole network of people to help take care of yourself, right? So I think of an example like, maybe you injured your ankle and you're gonna go in, you're gonna get an x-ray, and then you end up having the x-ray technician who takes that x-ray, you end up having a specialist who ends up reading the results of that x-ray. The results from that are going to go to maybe the ER doc, maybe your primary care, and then they're going to start to formulate that plan, that diagnosis, that response to that. And so we can think about the fact that, so for our organization, we have a lot of that expertise where everybody's collaborating together, they're figuring out how to help each other solve those issues. And we also depend on this really rich outside source of partnerships. And I want to pause a second to actually highlight a couple partnerships that are really important in terms of Paul and I. And I also did just realize I tend to forget this. I forgot to introduce myself, so I'll take a second to do that. So my name's Carrie, Carrie Schuman. I'm the Coastal Resilience Manager for SCCF, so it'll make a little bit more sense when I tell you about these partnerships. So first, Paul was recently brought on as a hydrological modeler, Paul Julian, and so Paul and I are going to be your speakers tonight. And Paul was brought on through a partnership with SCCF and the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. I was brought on as the Coastal Resilience Manager through a partnership with SCCF and the Captiva Erosion Prevention District. And so those are the types of partnerships that really help us do more extensive work for our region. And so we're really appreciative of the rich partnerships that help us do that. And so I'm going to kind of pull us through that sort of process, that the human health process, and how we're going to use that to think a little bit about how we take care of these natural systems. And so again, you may have seen these visuals before, but we'll kind of start with, again, thinking about that whole network of people that are involved with our health, and really the fact that we are trying to move towards, when we have these environmental issues or we have these things that we're addressing, we're trying to move towards some kind of prescriptive plan. We're trying to come up with that treatment, that medical plan. And some of the things that we do to get us there is we're leveraging technology, we're looking at vital signs, we're doing testing to help us understand those natural systems, and we're leveraging those to get us to that diagnostic plan. And so that was the focus of our last event, is we had a couple folks from SCCF talk about vital signs, so the kind of work that they did to really understand our system. So we had Leah Reidenbach, who was our policy and our research associate in the Marine Lab. We had Eric Milbrandt, who's the director, and they talked about their work concerning water quality, understanding harmful algal blooms, the kind of technology they used, drone imagery, the recon network. And so that was a way to think about using that testing and that leveraging that technology to help us understand those systems. And tonight we're going to get more into the application side. We're going to pull in some of those vital signs, but we're also going to talk about where we take those vital signs. What is the kind of planning? What are the kinds of applications we're using that for? And we also think about the fact that if it's possible, our most effective approaches are going to try as much as we can to really get at the causes and not just the symptoms. And sometimes we'll have to do a little bit of both. We'll have to address the symptoms of an issue, but that at the same time, our more lasting effective solutions are really going to involve also really trying to understand the causes and to address those. And, you know, even though you're getting a look at just a little bit of this application, a little bit of this planning part, I really just want to reiterate that this is something that you're going to see across all the programs and departments at SCCF. So, and that's going to look different depending on what program you're talking about. And I'll give you a couple examples so we can think about. We got some of the vital signs in the research that the Marine Lab is doing, but if we think about the application, so they're going to take those research results, and those are going to get reported to the people who are going to use those for decision making. They're going to work on fostering these productive research relationships that can help them continue to characterize and understand those systems. They're going to try and secure grant money to help us expand the amount of research and where we can do that. If we're talking about something like RC School, we might think about the fact that they're going to think about the needs of our community and our education needs, and they're going to develop these really experiential learning programs that are really meant to sort of capture the minds and the hearts of our students and to foster that sense of stewardship and coexisting with our natural systems for both Sanibel and Captiva. So what you're going to get tonight is just a little bit of perspective on a couple of us newbies. So you're going to hear from Paul Julian. Again, he's our hydrological modeler, and you're going to hear from me afterwards as a fairly recent addition as well as the Coastal Resilience Manager. A couple housekeeping things. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a combined Q&A session at the end. So after I'm done talking, both Paul and I will come up. The way this will work is we understand that we have both virtual attendees and we have people here. So somebody will be walking around in the audience with a microphone to take those questions from people who are here. For those folks who are at home, what we'll do is if you could drop your questions in the Q&A, we will try and gather those and kind of work on concurrently getting a mixture of those questions. So I just, again, thank you for being here, and then now I'm going to turn things over to Paul Julian.
Oh, Jesus. Sorry, I'm a giant. All right. So thank you very much, Carrie, and welcome everybody, both out there in TV land as well as here in person. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about kind of the stuff that I've done, I do for SCCF in partnership with the Conservancy. Like Carrie said, I'm a hydrologic modeler, so when I say hydrologic anything to most people, they're like, huh? Basically, what I do is I put some context in how the water moves. And something that is actually pretty striking is this title slide here is from our drone that Leah Reinenbach flies every week. And it's looking out at the Sanibel lighthouse out across the bay there. And one thing that it provides context, at least for me as I see it, to the hydrology of South Florida. We have the ocean right there in front of you. Out in the distance, we have the rain clouds. It's trickling down the seasonal rain that we get. And it hits the ground and it runs off and it comes back to the ocean eventually. The title of this is Rolling River, Tell Me What Do You See on Your Long Journey from the Okeechobee to the Sea. And this is actually a call out to an old folk song. I think it's the Kingston Trio, Rolling River. And it's, as we talk about things, I'm going to show you that Okeechobee is kind of a big deal for us, and the water does take a long time to get here from there. It's about 60 miles. So before we talk about anything else, though, I really want to acknowledge the land on which we sit, and the land that we inhabit here has been cared for by innumerable generations of original peoples of the past whose memory we honor. This context of reconciliation is an opportunity for us to both heal, but also collaborate and foster environmental conservation. So on the map here, that little yellow dot, that's where we sit here in the in-person crowd. And so to kind of orient you around in the system, we have the Kissimmee River, which starts all the way up in pretty much Orlando, and it's about 134 miles long with a pretty large watershed. Then we have Lake Okeechobee. It's one of the largest, shallowest lakes in the continental U.S. It's kind of iconic in that, and that's about 734 square miles. If you sit in the middle, you probably couldn't see the other side. The Caloosahatchee, like I said, it's about 64 miles long from Okeechobee all the way down to the estuary where we sit today. And down south, we have the Everglades, the iconic river of grass. So back in the good old days, pre-drainage Everglades is what we call it, but it's before modern humans inhabited the area. In the wet season, in the summer season, the rains would come through, the lakes would swell, the rivers and creeks would flow, and the water would slowly trickle its way all the way down from Kissimmee area down into Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee would fill up and overflow its banks and flow into Florida Bay and in the Gulf of Mexico. And because of that way the water flowed, we had very unique ecosystems that showed up. So south of the lake, for instance, there was a swamp forest that eventually transitioned to a sawgrass plain and all the way down into the mangrove fringe down in Florida Bay. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Hamilton Diston had a great idea of connecting all the waterways so that we can move about and we can reclaim land. It started back in early 1911-ish, where a couple canals were dug, and this figure here on the right kind of shows a time series of when each kind of infrastructure got put in. So starting in 1911, a couple canals were dug and connected things, and eventually we got to the modern system that we have today in the 1970s. Here's a couple of old photos of the dredging equipment that was used to kind of take those meandering rivers and straighten them out, digging out the muck and widening the river. It was no small feat by any means. Historically, Lake Okeechobee was not connected to the Caloosahatchee by any means. There was a series of lakes, and we actually had a waterfall, what is now right around LaBelle. So historically, it wasn't connected, but because of all the dredging, we took a meandering river and straightened it out. And this is an overlay of the squiggly blue, essentially, is the meandering historic river where the oxbows and bends and crooks of the river were there. And on the image below is it's a city plan of LaBelle back in the 1920s. As I said, the way the water flow kind of really dictated back in the pre-drainage Everglades what the vegetation was. In the past, Lake Okeechobee was unhindered. In the wet season, it filled up and it went wherever the heck it wanted to. Unfortunately, in the post-drainage, I guess you can call it Everglades, in the modern Everglades, the present Everglades, there's a dike that encircles the lake. And it's, I can't remember the mileage, I think it's 180 miles or so around the lake of a dike that's, so I think it's 30, 40 feet tall in some areas. And that was put in place because populations south of the lake were flooded out during the early 1900s as hurricanes passed through. So there was a little bit of a human safety issue, but because of that dike, now the ecology of the lake is affected. And so in the name of flood control, we dammed, diked, and drained our lakes, rivers, and wetlands. And so remembering the historic flow path where it was green all the way from the Kissimmee all the way down to Florida Bay, now the flow is changed dramatically. In the current system, we have high discharges out the estuaries, very little flow going south into the Everglades, which impacts our estuaries from too much water and impacts our Everglades with too little water. And because of the way the infrastructure was put in and the way we managed the system, the vegetation changed dramatically. We still have some remnants of the historic Everglades, but it's vastly reduced. And so we went from pre-drainage to current, and now, thankfully, we're moving towards a restored system. And so that panel all the way to the right is some remnant of the historic system, but we still have some of the current flow patterns, I guess you can call it, in there. And it's all part of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, where we're trying to restore the quality, quantity, and timing and distribution of water so that way it can mimic somewhat of the pre-drainage Everglades. And so most of you are probably familiar with EKGs, and this is an example of an EKG where it's the echocardiogram. It measures, your heart rate if you're in the hospital, and typically goes beep, 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 and then in the movies it goes beep, and it's not good then. We have something very similar in the Everglades. Lake Okeechobee is considered the liquid heart of the Everglades. And as that water fills the lake and slowly leaves the lake through management, it looks sort of like an echocardiogram. Granted, some years aren't as good as others, so maybe that's a heart palpitation one year, or really excited year another. But what's really interesting, this is water level of Lake Okeechobee since 2015 to January of this year. And this is daily water level within the lake relative to sea level. And you can see where some years we hit really high levels, like back when Hurricane Irma passed, we exceeded 17 feet, which is a pretty big deal ecologically for the lake. And then some years we drop below 11, which also is very significant ecologically. Here's another way to look at it. So if you're sitting on the southeastern or southwestern bank of Okeechobee, you're looking to the northeast, this is the kind of a side view of the lake. And as water fills up and drains, you can see that brown color kind of pulsates. And what that is that as the water level increases, different areas of the lake is flooded. And so the lake isn't just a straight lake. We have a littoral zone, so an area of wetland along the edge, which is thriving ecologically for the plants and animals. And then we actually have a lake feature kind of in the middle. That's the deeper part, quote unquote, of the lake. And so as that heart beats, different parts of the system get flooded. In perfect times, that pulsating is a good thing. Because of instances like Irma and water management, water levels within the lake vary dramatically. In the lake, we also have our ecology, our biota. So this here is a plot of just submerged aquatic vegetation coverage within the lake, and this is in acres. And it's from back in 2002 all the way to current. And you can see that it kind of also does a little undulation. It's not a straight line. It's not going up or going down. There's changes from year to year. And those changes are linked to water levels within the lake. The top plot there shows the range in a given year of water level within the lake. And so some years, for instance, in 2008, we were really low for really long. And that was because we were in a drought. The vegetation in the lake can't handle, obviously, a drought. And so that became impacted. Conversely, the year Irma happened, we were really high for really long. So the vegetation was also impacted. So now if we look at it from a spatial context, just for the past 6 years or so, there's the map on the left-hand side here shows kind of the distribution of some of that vegetation. And you can see that as we go from the top left to the bottom right, the colors kind of change and also get diminished. And that's showing the spatial decline of this submerged aquatic vegetation, which is essential for the ecology of the lake. For instance, most of you probably like going fishing, right? Well, without SAV, you're not going to be going fishing out there. That provides essential habitat for bass in the lake. which of course affects the birds as well because there's no prey. And so there's kind of a cascade effect. If we impact one part of the lake through management, other parts will be affected. And so what does that mean for our estuary? So here's a hydrograph of discharge at S79, the Franklin Lock, if you go upriver all the way to the freshwater portion. And those arrows show the periods of time when it was really high flow. And really high flow at S79, the Franklin Lock, can have significant impacts down here in the estuary. For instance, in periods when we have really high water, really high discharges, we can have really brown water in the estuary. That's natural, but if it's too high for too long, then of course the ecology of the estuary is affected, as in that submerged aquatic vegetation I was talking about in the lake. We also have submerged aquatic vegetation out in the estuary, and that brown water for too long affects it being able to grow. We also have years when we have discharges and that concur with drift algae. For instance, the picture down on the bottom there with the people in it, that is back in 2006 when we had the red drift algae problem where it was 3 feet deep on the beach. And most of you probably remember 2018 when we had the blue-green algae crisis, and that also corresponded with significant elevated discharges. Of course, there's the other side of the coin when we can have too little flow. And so too little of fresh water into the estuary can make it so that salt water makes it all the way up to that structure, that Franklin Lock, which isn't good. Because there's, in this instance, we have on that top picture in 2008 during that drought, on the freshwater side, it was pea soup. On the other side, it was not. It was mostly saline at that point. And being saline in a freshwater system kind of screws around with the ecology a little bit. And it also can affect, too little freshwater flow into the estuary can also affect, organisms in this area. For instance, oysters can't handle too salty conditions or too fresh conditions. They're kind of in that sweet spot. Same thing with our seagrasses. They can't be too salty or too fresh. And so the way we get discharges into the estuary are ultimately dictated by the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. And so some of you may have heard the term LORS 08 or LORS or LOSUM kind of thrown out there. And this is kind of what on the slide here is kind of the regulation schedule and the decision tree that is used to kind of dictate where water goes when. And so the current water management scheme for Lake Okeechobee and its downstream estuaries are dictated by this. And it's kind of a flow chart plus some scientific input, from both agency scientists as well as stakeholders of when water can be put where, ultimately. And so we're moving from that LORS 08 to LOSUM, or Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And ultimately what this means is we're changing the way we're managing the lake, which means we're going to change the way water is delivered to the estuaries. And it's in coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers, South Florida Water Management District, and other stakeholders. Ultimately, what we wanted to do is incorporate flexibility in how we manage the lake while balancing the congressionally authorized purposes of Lake Okeechobee and Herbert Hoover Dike. And so those being flood protection, water supply, ecology, as well as recreation. And below there's the several objectives that were kind of outlined during that Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual planning project. And so in the new system, in the new regulation schedule, we've transitioned from very rigid, lots of lines, lots of decisions to be made, to a rather simplified plan that provides some benefit to the Caloosahatchee estuary. And so we have a relative certainty in how much, when we're going to get the discharges, essentially, to the Caloosahatchee. And some of those discharges are good and needed. So when discharges are in the quote-unquote optimal conditions, when the ecology is going to benefit the most, we're going to get an increase in those, which is great. we're also going to get a decrease in the stressful and damaging flows. So when it's really high or too low, those are going to be decreased, which is great. We're going to see a good balance in how the water is being delivered to the lake, or to the estuary. Unfortunately, we do have some bad. We do have instances where really, really high flows will increase slightly during this planning or this new regulation schedule. And all this is kind of balanced on the back of the lake. So in this new plan, ultimately we're going to keep the lake higher for longer. And so you can imagine that's going to affect the ecology of the lake as well. And so, sorry about that. To harken back to the medical terminology, right? The Caloosahatchee Okeechobee Everglades system is a dynamic system with a long history of change. You and me both know as we age, we change. I know I can't run as fast as I did 10 years ago. Thankfully, restoration is moving forward to increase both our wetlands, our water quality, and increase our water storage across the landscape. So we have our doctors in place, putting together a good plan to kind of help us move along into the future. And our understanding of water management is slowly evolving to kind of eke out any benefits across the system. And so as supplements get better, as medical knowledge gets better, we're able to kind of improve as things move along. So ultimately, kind of what I've been trying to tell you guys a little bit is the way we manage our upstream system, our freshwater system, really is a way that we can build a little bit of resilience in our estuary and our coastal environment. Carrie's going to talk a little bit about that, but before I hand the mic over, this is actually a demonstration model that I put together that shows as discharges increase, the salinity within the estuary changes. And if you watch it long enough, you'll notice the little stoplight on the right changes. And there's a little bit of a sweet spot in how much discharge the lake can, or the estuary can receive. And that sweet spot is what we call the optimum condition. And that means that the salinity within the estuary is of par for the ecosystem. Thought it was a little neat little toy model for you guys to show. So, Carrie, it's all yours.
And I'm shorter, so all right. Let's see. Okay, so again, I really appreciate that connection between these estuarine systems going down to these coastal systems. So I'm going to talk a bit broadly this evening, both because I want a chance to talk to you about what coastal resilience is and to kind of set that stage, and to give you some examples and some ideas about how my work and how sort of SCCF as an organization fits into that, and also against the backdrop of the fact that coastal resilience for SCCF is a fairly new focus, and so this undoubtedly will grow and evolve over time, but I can give you some starting insight into what it's beginning to shape into, what it's beginning to look like. And okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to maybe throw a wrench not really a wrench into the works, but I'm going to try and do something a little interactive for us. So first of all, some folks who have seen me, I'm starting to make the rounds and I'm starting to talk to different groups, and so there probably will be a little overlap with some of what some people may have heard me talk before, but one difference here, first of all, is going to be that I'm going to really lean into that health analogy in a way that will make my dad, who is a pediatrician, proud. So I'm really going to go there with that. And I also really like to start this conversation by anchoring us into this idea of what resilience is. And so I've often been kind of starting my talks and asking people what they think of when they hear the word resilience. So I'm actually going to have us try something a little interactive. If it doesn't work, we'll roll with the punches. So for those of you who are in the audience, you can go ahead and pull out your cell phones. Same for those folks at home. And what I want you to do is I want you to go to this website. So it is www.menti, and Menti is spelled MENTI.com. For those of you at home that you can also, I put the QR code in, so if you're savvy with a QR code reader, you can go ahead and scan it. We'll bring you right to that website. And you can go ahead and enter this code. I'm going to read it off for you. The code is 57, oh no. The code is 5702-7769. I'm going to leave this up for a minute. I'll read that one more time. But essentially what I'm going to do is hop to the website, and it should generate something like a word cloud for us so we can see what people are thinking, because we've got a fair amount of people joining us from online too. So we'll see if this works. Again, if it doesn't, we'll move on. But so go to www.menti.com. Enter the code 5702-7769. It will ask you what word or phrase do you think of when you hear the word resilience? Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this and see if I can bring up that website, and we'll see if people are if this is working. Okay. Oh, and it is. That's exciting. And hopefully folks can see it at home, but if they can't, there's all kinds of things happening on the screen here. So what we're seeing is, what does it mean to be resilient? So I'm seeing all kinds of great phrases and words. So the ability to bounce back, robust, flexible, survival, thrive when things change, ability to recover, agile. So we've got some really great ideas here, and you can go ahead and keep entering, because I'll probably try and save this after too. I like carry on, adaptive. So you guys have some great ideas here. So I think the nice thing about doing an exercise like this is that we can see that we really do have an idea of what resilience means. We have this sort of mental anchor that helps us understand what resilience means. So I'm going to give you a definition, but we know inherently there's some idea of what we're talking about, right? So coastal resilience, this is a definition I like. This is a NOAA definition. So resilience, it's that ability to, and you probably can see some words here that we saw on the screen a few minutes ago, right? That idea of adapting to changing conditions, rapidly recover from disruptions, that bouncing back idea. And who does this really refer to? So there's a few components we really think about when we think about resilience. So of course we're talking about those natural systems, but we're also thinking about our infrastructure, kind of that interchange between that infrastructure and our communities, the people that are involved with this. And let's sort of start to lean into that idea of this sort of health analogy, right? So when we think about resilience, we're trying to think about, wanting to recover from current symptoms and illness, and to really try and safeguard ourselves from future illness and future symptoms that we can expect. So when we talk about coastal resilience, what are those symptoms? What is that kind of illness that we're thinking about, that we're trying to build that resilience to? And so I want to start to dive in here. So typically in the coastal resilience the coastal resilience world, what we're typically talking about is we're thinking about effects of climate change. And so this is not going to be exhaustive, but really what we're going to focus on is some key ideas that are going to be really core to a place like us, to our barrier islands. So we can think about symptoms that we're looking at that involve temperature, and I'm going to come back to all of these and kind of walk us through them. But temperature is really a core important symptom because it has knock-on effects. So what are those knock-on effects? What are those things that it could lead to? And so it underpins some changes that we might expect in rainfall, in storm intensity, and sea level rise. And oftentimes what you'll see is a lot of these will be combined under the umbrella of coastal flooding. And so when this is talked about at the state level, a lot of times these are sort of the components that they're talking about. And first, I kind of want to come back to temperature and think about that in the idea of human health. And so we've got this idea of temperature. It's a really important symptom that is really connected to these other ideas. And we can think about the idea that in the human body, we use something like a fever to give us some indication that something else is going on, that we might have some kind of infection, that there's something we need to pay attention to. And I know, of course, so that image on the right probably brings us back to our experience over the last couple years, right? So that's been a really sort of key vital sign, a really key symptom we've been following to understand, as sort of that marker of, oh, there's something else going on with us physically. So we can think of that in the same way here. And so if we think about this, what are the signs that we have these temperature fluctuations, that we have something, some corollary to a fever for our state? Like, what is this looking like? And so let's look at some trends and how those temperature changes are happening for Florida. And so this gives you an example where you see statewide average summer temperatures. And you see, this is broken down by roughly, looks like 10 to 20 years. And you can see this upward trend, and then you can see projections for where we might be headed. You can also see that mirrored in this, for example, this is another pattern in the average number of days with highs above 95 degrees. And of course, that has implications for our wildlife, for our natural systems, for our outdoor workers, for the people that live here. But I also want to talk about how this underpins some of the other things we're thinking about, especially with water. So precipitation patterns, it's a little hard to talk about some of this in Florida because we have very variable rainfall patterns. But we can probably expect some overall large-scale patterns that we might see into the future. And so one of the things we may see is a little bit of gradation across the state, where we see overall over the course of a year, maybe more total rainfall in the northern part of the state and less total over the southern part of the state. But one really important rule of thumb, and we see this in global patterns, and I think we're going to see this in our local story too, is we think about it's a story of extremes. So we will see drier dries and we'll see wetter wets. And the reason why this is something we need to think about on a scale for us is especially when we have these heavy rain events. So that means, a lot of rain dropped in a short period of time. That means we have to start thinking about our stormwater capacity, right? And so that's how that fits into this picture. Our trends in hurricanes. So if we think about these sort of fever conditions, that sort of vital sign that we're paying attention to for air temperature, we also want to think about how that's going to affect our sea surface temperatures. And the reason that matters in terms of hurricanes is because that warm, moist air that comes from the ocean really is the fuel for those hurricanes. And what you see in that figure, that little orange band, that's the equatorial band that shows you where sea surface temperature is warm enough for those hurricanes to form. And hurricanes tend to form in waters that are 80 degrees Fahrenheit or above. And so again, you'll see that, you'll see some of those sea surface temperatures rising, so more fuel for those hurricanes. And there's some other patterns that we're starting to see. So more fuel means more intense hurricanes. We are starting to see some trends where we're seeing hurricanes traveling along their pathways a little bit more slowly. And they're also taking a little bit longer to decay over land. So they're sticking around for a little bit longer. And so that means, again, like thinking about those heavy rain events, there's more opportunity for those storms to drop more water. They're sticking around longer. And so what that means is what we need to think about then is what are our solutions where we think about more wind that can help us deal with more wind, wave energy, with storm surge. And if we think about those two other pieces that came before, those two other sort of water connections, we can think of those as really episodic events, right? So, and we're used to dealing with hurricanes. We're just thinking about, a symptom that we're used to dealing with, but it's going to amp up over time. It's going to amplify. But this is sort of our sort of consistent low-level symptom that's going to start to amp up over time. And so sea level rise, the thing that we want to think about is the fact that it's driven by lots of different factors. On a global level, it's really driven by temperature. On a local level, you're certainly going to have some variability for things like how much your land is rising or sinking, what your ocean circulation is doing, but really it is a story of temperature. And I want to talk a little bit about what our local story looks like. So what you'll see on the left is you'll see that that is actual data pulled from the Fort Myers tide gauge, and this is how things have been changing over time. So you can see that over time, we've had an increase of about 3 millimeters per year, okay? The trick with this is that all the projections and the understanding around sea level rise is that we're not going to stick with that linear increase. So I'm going to ask you to think a little bit back to your math classes. It's probably been a little while. It's been a little while for me. But if you have a straight line, it means it's changing at a consistent rate over time. But what our projections tell us about sea level rise is that really what we should expect is ultimately we're going to move to a linear trend. We're going to move to something that looks more like a curve, which means we're going to see those rates change. They're going to increase over time. Now, the tricky thing when we're talking about sea level rise, when we're talking about a lot of these patterns, is thinking about the uncertainty that can be part of this story. And the way I think about this medically is, we know something's coming down the pike for us. So let's think about, say I'm prone to a particular kind of disease. I know it runs in my family. Some of the uncertainty that might come there is that maybe there's a lot that I don't know about how well I'm going to handle my personal health or treat my body over a certain amount of time. And there's certain things I might not understand about my genetic predisposition to certain things that might interact with that, okay? So sea level rise, our projections are kind of incorporating the same kind of ideas. Our science is getting better, and we're getting better at producing these projections. I'll actually tell you that there was a report released yesterday that might give us some results that are slightly different from this, but I haven't even had a chance to read it, so you may hear a little bit more from us on some updates on this story as well. But these kinds of patterns also include how our policies, how our greenhouse gas emissions will play into these sort of possible futures. So what we do is we plan for a whole suite of possible futures that takes into account some of that uncertainty. Okay? And then we can think about, I'm going to give you a couple rough tools, okay? These are very rough, but we can think about this as sort of the ability to have some imaging to let us know what we might expect, okay? There are some caveats here, but this is something that people are working on. They're working on better ways to really incorporate all these pieces to tell us a story of what it is that we're expecting. And so this will just give you an overview of the kinds of things that we're looking at and how we want to think about them. So first of all, this first tool here is something you could look at on your own. It's a tool where you can go in, you can put in your address, and it can kind of run through for your location what flooding might look like. And then the sea level rise viewer is a tool that NOAA's put together. So remember I mentioned they just came out with a new report, so it may be that what you see as visualizations with this tool might change a little bit. A couple caveats for what I'm going to show you too is that the way some of these things interact, you might not capture all of this in this particular tool. So for example, this might show, what this shows you in the next picture is what you're going to see is you're going to see where water is going to show up over time with a certain projected amount of sea level rise, and it's going to be where you might expect water with the highest high tides. It's not really showing you that this area is going to be inundated all the time, but it's going to show you areas that are vulnerable to the highest high tides. And I set it to be 2 feet of sea level rise, which based on those possible futures, we might be able to expect between maybe 2050, 2060. So again, sort of a rough kind of tool, but thinking about the fact that we're trying to get our imaging, we're trying to refine that so we can make better choices. So let me give you a little bit of, let me sort of explain what you're seeing. And so on the left, what you're seeing is what things look like now. On the right, so again, that would be roughly about 2050, 2060. The tricky part here too is you don't see units on that bar for water depth. Really, the way I would think about this is a way to at least conceptually show you that here's parts of the island where we need to start thinking about water differently, where we don't deal with water in the same way, where in the future we're going to have to start thinking about where that water goes and what we're going to do in response. So again, sort of rough tool, but gives you, the start to thinking about this. Okay? And here's where I really want to start to turn the talk towards, potential solutions, adaptations, where do we go with this kind of medical plan? What are the things that we want to do in response to this? And again, I'm going to give you some broad ideas, but I talk about this as a kind of topic that people just need to keep engaging with. It's something where we start the conversation, we're going to learn more, and we're just going to keep engaging with this kind of topic over time. So the first thing I think about is, remember we talked about, ideally, we really want to try as much as we can to focus on causes as well as symptoms. And with something like coastal resilience, we're really working on multiple angles on this kind of issue. We are looking at the causes and the symptoms, and we're really trying to combine these facets. And so when we talk about coastal resilience, looking at those causes or treating the root causes is really where we start to get into mitigation. And mitigation means that we're thinking about those causes, those vital signs. We're looking at our greenhouse gas emissions. We're thinking about temperature, and we really are going to monitor those over time. So that's why I think about those as both sort of symptoms, but also our vital signs to help us understand those sort of knock-on effects that those contribute to. And the reason why, we work on these at the same time is that we want to improve, we want to whittle down, we want to narrow the amount of possible futures that we're going to adapt to, and that's going to allow us to have more successful adaptation efforts into the future. And so what does that look like? And so I think for our organization, things that we think about and are getting involved in and would like to see is we want to advocate and support the adoption of renewables, for example. So I am representing SCCF with a renewable energy group that I'll actually give a little teaser for this. This is a group that is co-chaired by a local resident, Bob Moore, and then James Evan, our CEO, is also co-chair. And what we're hoping to do is provide recommendations for the city that can kind of kickstart us on this route, and we'll have some kind of event most likely in April, so it's just a little teaser that you'll see some details around that. But there's other things that SCCF does that really fits into this too. When we acquire land and we have all these natural systems that are growing, we're adding to our carbon mitigation capacity. So there's a lot of things that we do as an organization that are really increasing that capacity. I also know that we're really invested in advising, supporting, adaptation planning. And so this is where we start to get into that sort of medical plan. And I also just dropped in a little bit of a little medical joke here. This is one that I grew up hearing from my dad all the time. But so this is where we start to think about, so what is it that we're really going to do to respond to this? And so this is where the planning becomes really important. And this is where I think of it partially as a preventative approach of saying, okay, there's a suite of symptoms, of things that we can expect into our future, so we need to start thinking and start really getting into that planning mode of understanding what are the things that we could do in response. And we can do this at lots of different levels. So we like to see this is happening at the state level. There's legislation, a statute that's sort of set the rules of engagement for this to happen at the state level. We're starting to see this happen at our municipal levels. So this is something people are engaging in. And what does this really involve? What does it mean to plan? So what we're doing is we're characterizing our risks. So we're trying to really paint a very specific picture about those details that I talked to you about before, those kind of symptoms that we can expect. We want to understand what's affected and when, and so it's sort of overlaying that information with understanding, what parts of our communities are affected, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of natural habitats, and so getting a sense of what that looks like. Exploring our solutions, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then because this is something we're going to engage with for a long time, it's taking that opportunity to basically regroup and review and really just keep learning through this process. And this is something, we're going to get better at doing these things, and it's something that everybody is engaging with over time. And so in terms of solutions, I know that one of the things our organizations and I advocate for is what we call nature-based green infrastructure solutions. And to tell you what we're thinking about there. So what that means is really taking stock of the kind of natural habitats we have, either using pre-existing habitats or using new living components as part of our solutions, because they have a lot of protective advantage for us. And there are going to be instances, there are communities that find, depending on sort of your wave action, the kind of conditions that you're under, there are instances where you may need to combine these elements with something that is harder, that is more engineered. But if you combine these approaches, that's where you start to use some of your natural components to protect some of your built components, and where you still maintain your co-benefits, the things that you care about that you get from those natural systems. And so I think there's two ways to really think about this. So first of all, when we think about resilience, we want to think about how we foster these really healthy natural systems. And so some of the things that Paul talked about with really trying to promote that positive water quality, that's going to help keep our systems healthy and into the future and flourishing. But we also want, again, they're a really advantageous asset for us because they protect us. And so I'll give you a couple examples of what that looks like. So first of all, we've got a couple systems down at the bottom. We've got pictures of oyster reefs. We've got pictures of mangroves, which we know we've got a lot of great mangroves around. We've got pictures of salt marsh. And so the thing that we're thinking about here is, first of all, these kinds of systems, especially systems that build structure, these are really good systems for helping to break wave and wind energy. So that means they're going to help kind of protect and buffer that coastline when you have these systems intact and in place. The other thing that's pretty interesting is that these systems have the possibility to sometimes keep pace with sea level rise. And so that means, the oyster reefs, they can grow in height over time. Mangroves can accrete sediment. So in the right conditions, they have that ability. There was a great study, economic study, of how much economic value mangroves brought to Lee and Collier counties in the face, just on a yearly basis, and in the face of Irma, and that value is in the billions. So these are really powerful solutions. And for a place like Sanibel and Captiva, where we already value that, we already have some of those steps in play, which is really exciting. A couple other pieces I just want to pull in for work that SCCF does that I'm sort of integrated into that I think are important too is what our policy team does. So I think about policy as being like patient advocacy. So that means we're paying attention to bills, we're paying attention to planning, and we're kind of figuring out how those fit into the bigger picture. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like for on our legislative tracker, you can see that we're following some climate and resilience bills. We're also following, for example, the net metering bill, so we see those as having implications for our resilient future. And then the last piece I want to talk about here is our communications and outreach. And so there's so much room here. I view this as being sort of the public health awareness piece, right? Really letting people know what we're thinking about, what we need to engage with. I've heard a lot of talk about how we have a lot of new residents moving in. We have a lot of new visitors coming in. And so this is our opportunity to let them know what's going on, how we're starting to think about this, how we're starting to engage with this issue. And so I'm giving lots of talks in the community. You're starting to probably see coastal resilience have more of a profile across our communications efforts. So I'm starting things like our regular feature, our coastal resilience connections. I know there's interest for us in figuring out how we bring resilience as a cross-cutting concept across some of our education pieces. So really what I wanted to do is give you a sort of an overview of how I've been fitting in and how I see us fitting in some of those directions. But with that, I think I'd like to end, but we're going to go into our Q&A, and I just really, again, thank you for listening.
Okay, everybody, for our Q&A, I'll hold the mic and stand at a distance for you. I'll hold the mic.
Okay. In terms of resiliency and looking at it from a medical analogy, is you need to not only look at the developing of, I believe, the treatments, but you have to look at the resilience to chemotherapy. The treatments themselves can be problems. Most recently with the COVID, we've seen that we may not be so resilient in accepting vaccines or mask mandates, even though they might be the treatment necessary. The other thing that I'd like to comment on is, like, we talk about sea level rise. I go out on the water a lot, and I really enjoy looking at the bottom, and I'm kind of concerned about sea level deepening and the loss and change of benthic habitats. So those are my comments.
Yeah, so maybe I'll comment on a couple pieces there. So I think you're, so I think you hit on a really important point about the idea of solutions around resilience, and it is a lot about balance and figuring out what we're okay with for trade-offs, and I think that's sort of the part of the conversation that we have to be having with our communities on that. So, you know, in terms of our value systems, So for example, if we were going to put in just hard infrastructure, there are, you know, erosive impacts that can occur with hard infrastructure. And so we'd have to think very carefully about what we're okay with there. And that's why I think we advocate for those balanced solutions that have that component, that provide us with those co-benefits of nature, that make this a place that we still want to live. So you're right. This is a tough problem with solutions that have trade-offs, and that's part of this kind of conversation. Is conversations about risk, about tolerance, and sort of our value system and what we're okay with. And so I really see that as sort of part of our process. And then I think, you know, you're sort of also hitting on the idea of other kinds of factors that fit into keeping resilient systems, you know, in having these healthy natural systems that are going to give us protection. And if you see eroding of, you know, the sea bottom or, you know, what you're doing is you're not supporting these healthy systems that you can then use as leverage for some of those solutions into the future. So I see a lot of connections between these pieces. And that's something I also kind of hope to bring out in kind of what I do and what I talk about too, is to make sure people see those connections.
Who's doing it well? We hear about the Dutch, and they've been living basically under sea level for over a century. Are there any other places, are there any places in North America that are doing it right yet? You know, I'll tell you, this is like one of those situations where I'm not prepared to answer that on the spot, and I'd have to think about that. You know, I think it's one of those things where there's so many pieces to the process where maybe you think about parts of what people are doing well. Like, are they doing the communication right? Are they involving the community in the right way to come up with the solutions? Are those solutions working effectively? And to some degree, I think also for a place like us where we haven't been doing this as long, I don't know that we, again, you know, some of this, as I look into it, I might form some different ideas over time, but I think the hard part for us too is that because we haven't been at it that long, we may not have that full picture yet. It may become a lot clearer later, but I will tell you there's a lot of things that I'll say if you ask me in 6 months or a year, I might have a much different answer. So that's a great question, and I'll have to do some deep thinking about it. Yeah.
So what, if anything, is SSCF doing to protect the mangrove forest of Pine Island, which is a significant part of the estuary here? And I'm from Pine Island, and I drove over to hear what you're going to do. Sorry, I put you on the spot.
No, it's okay, and it's unfortunate because I feel like there's some of these things, because remember I told you about the sort of holistic connections between all the different work that happens here, where I can tell you part of the picture, but there's other people who can tell you a more complete picture. So for example, I think that I think he could have been here, but Eric, our Marine Lab director, he's the person that can really tell you exactly, you know, what's going on with their restoration and what his perspective is on that.
And I apologize for jumping in. I'm very aware of what the Marine Lab does, and they're phenomenal.
Sure.
Recon is super. But come over to Pine Island. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've got amazing mangrove forest, and there's an incredible pressure for development. Most of the island's on septic, and all that water's coming over here to Sanibel.
Yeah, and the other thing that's really interesting about mangroves is there really is such a push and pull in terms of how people coexist with them in places as well.
I think this is where we start to get into that idea of people having to really consider trade-offs and what they're okay with. So I'll give you the example of a push and pull I see a lot of places, especially with development, is both, removing mangroves or, thinking about how they sort of impinge on people's views. And I know we've got certain legislation in place that controls some of that behavior, but I think this is where people are going to start having to ask themselves questions of saying, if I want to protect my property into the future with these things that I'm expecting, I'm going to have to start thinking about the trade-offs that I'm okay with relative to having these more protective natural environments and incorporating them into around my property and thinking about that. But
This might be a good time to introduce one of our Zoom questions. Linda asks, if mangroves help the bay side of Sanibel and Fort Myers, what would help the Gulf side?
What would help the Gulf side? So thinking about the Gulf side, so especially when we need to kind of think about the properties that are different between these two different sides of the island. So a lot of what we would do on the Gulf side would have to do with thinking about how we work with our dune system and how we think about our beaches. And so the kinds of solutions that might be more appropriate on that side, this is where you might think about some things like living shorelines, where you might start thinking about some hybrid solutions. There are some very interesting designs where you can incorporate harder structures underneath dune systems, but then you need to also think about the dynamic changes of a beach. So those are just some starting ideas, but that's the kind of thing where you just need to sort of acknowledge the difference in those approaches and start to look at, again, that's where you start to look at some models where people have done this in different places and start to see what they've found has been effective in these different systems. But it is important to note that we've got these really different coastlines, right? And that's something to think about, is the solutions in one place are not going to be appropriate for certain places, for certain coastlines. You've got to think about your natural habitats there. You want to think about your wave energy, your wind energy. So there's just a variety of pieces that you think about, and folks who work on the engineering are going to take some of those into account. And when we work on those together, that's the kinds of things you're thinking about that would dictate the different kinds of solutions that you might use.
Okay, we have one last Zoom question. Mike asks, your graph of flooding of the islands at high tide would indicate flooding with salt water into the Sanibel Slough. True? Must we expect to lose freshwater refuge on Sanibel?
So repeat that again?
I'm sorry, yes. Your graph of flooding on the island at high tides would indicate flooding with salt water into the Sanibel Slough. Is this true? Must we expect to lose freshwater refuge on Sanibel?
So I'm not going to get into, I feel like this is almost like a modeling question where I feel like Paul would almost be a little bit more suited to answer this. Remember, this is kind of a rough tool. I'll answer this in a sort of broad sense of, would we expect to lose some freshwater habitat? If we are going to see more inundation of salt water, we will expect to see some shifts in the kind of habitat that we see. I can think there's sort of a balance that's going on with these natural systems, especially ones they're sort of conducive to these. You've got these systems that can deal with some shift in salinity, but you'll either see sort of two responses with these systems, and it's usually a balance between either having that ability to accrete and to build up that land underneath them and to keep up with sea level rise, or you may see some of these habitats move inland, in which case you could have some displacement. It's something that we see in other places too with, for example, temperature. You may be familiar with the idea that we have seen a bit of a march of mangroves up Florida coastlines, right? And so some of that is a replacement of salt marsh in some areas with mangroves because the temperature regime has started to change. So I think it's sort of an inevitable, I'm a little trouble with that word, inevitable that we're going to see some shifts in our natural systems, and we're going to have to be adaptive and thinking about, how do we also respond to those shifts and those things that we might see with our natural systems.
Along those lines, one of the things I worry about is the impact of rising sea levels on our fresh water and drinking water. And has anybody been looking into that in terms of?
Yeah, so I will tell you that that kind of interplay with, especially with drinking water sources, is something that is talked about at multiple levels. And so this is something that's being fit into plans at it's being talked about at the state levels. That's fit into some of the current legislation that's being reviewed in the House and the Senate right now. The South Florida Water Management District also alludes to that in some of their planning. So in the large conversation about resilience, there's certainly people across the state at lots of little, different levels also thinking about the drinking water piece and water resources as part of that whole puzzle. Let me just say, sorry, you're hitting end of the evening or end of the day me, so it's taken me a second. So the last thing I did want to just say really quickly is I did want to plug that we are having an Everglades update next month. That will be our next event. It is on March 10th, and you will see upcoming details. You'll see a description of what we're going to cover in that, but I just want to let you know that that's coming up. So just thanks again for being here, for having this conversation, for engaging with us, and I hope everyone has a really great evening.